people on the call, so we'll make a start now. And first of all, welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Hannah Broadbent. I'm the head of communications at Ember. We're going to be exploring Europe's electricity transition in the coming decade. Charles Moore, who's Ember's European programme lead, will spend around half an hour sharing the results of our recent report that analysed the national energy and climate plan of every EU country. We'll then have some reflections from those working on the ground in some of the 7 countries we're identified as falling furthest behind. We'll then have plenty of time for questions. So throughout the presentation, please do use the Q&A tool you can see at the bottom of the screen. You can add questions and upvote the questions you would like answered. If you haven't done so already, please share in the chat your name, organisation, country, and what you hope to gain from this webinar. It's great to see colleagues joining us from around Europe, in Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, Kosovo, Luxembourg, and even wider. If you have any technical issues or questions, please feel free to use the chat function to message my colleague Phil, and we'd be happy to support you. During the presentation, we'll have a couple of interactive polls, which will pop up on your screen, so get ready to answer. And after the session, we'll send you the slides, and you can also access the full report, supporting data, and all the charts on our website, ember-climate.org. We'll also be recording this session and publishing it on our YouTube channel for those who are unable to join us today. We really hope you enjoy the session, and I'll hand over to my colleague Charles to begin his presentation. Thanks all.
Thanks for the intro, Hannah. Yep, so as Hannah says, we'll be going through the Vision or Division report that you can find on our website. My name is Charles Moore, I head up the European programme here. And in this report, we essentially set out the case of why we think there are 7 countries that are blocking the EU electricity transition and using the NACPs as the evidence for that. So what I'm going to do through this webinar is present some of the findings and effectively over the course of the slides build up our case as to why we think these 7 countries in particular are the ones we need to focus on. So just a little to start with, for those of you who aren't aware of who Ember are, what we do, we're a UK-based think tank, but with the presence in India and Australia, and our mission is to accelerate the global electricity transition from coal to clean. And we use data and analysis, and we use that to support high impact policy, to shape the global narrative on coal, and to empower campaign organizations and journalists to support that work as well. So a little bit about the NEC project itself and the NECPs. So the NECP is a horrible acronym for the National Energy and Climate Plans. And what is a National Energy and Climate Plan? Under EU law, each EU member state must submit a climate and energy plan detailing their objectives and the policies that are required to meet those objectives over the coming decade. And the EU Commission then uses that plan to assess whether the Union as a whole is on track to meet its climate targets and where certain countries may need additional work. And what we've done in this report is we've assessed the national energy and climate plans of each of the 27 EU member states, and we've taken all the electricity data from those plans. A health warning. So the NACPs describe an ambition from governments. It doesn't necessarily mean that the policies and measures to achieve that ambition are yet in place. And on the flip side, we're actually seeing in some cases, the NACPs are perhaps already looking a little bit unambitious compared to what will be achieved in reality, but both is the case. It's not necessarily true whether the policies are in place to achieve these goals. And a second note is that these plans were done prior to the EU Green Deal. So when the European Council meets in December, hopefully to agree higher climate targets, these plans will need to be updated to reflect that higher climate ambition. So while not perfect, the NACPs are the best available data set we have to tell us what is happening in the power transition right now, and therefore also where governments need to move faster given higher climate ambition coming in the coming years. And just a quick note on data quality. So in the data in the slides that I'll present, there's very variable across the NACPs, both by country and by type on the quality of the data available, but we can make some general statements. Effectively, all the renewables generation data and the renewable shares of electricity mix is very, very good. And these are kind of key indicators that the NACPs require. The data on coal, fossil gas, and nuclear is quite good. And then as we move down to electricity consumption, it's okay. And then other fossil fuels like kind of oil, waste, etc., pretty poor data. And just bear that in mind when we kind of present the results. And then just a final note that NACPs tend to show, most NACPs show projections for not only the measures that they already have in place, but policies they expect to put in place or have a good chance of being in place in the coming years. And we include those measures in the analysis as well. So what does the NACPs tell us about the EU27 and the headline indicators? And what we're seeing is that the NACPs lay out a major transformation of the EU electricity system over the next decade. And we see renewables moving from around about 32% in the electricity mix to near 60% in 2030. Wind and solar moving from a quite minor role in 2018, 15%, to forming the backbone of the electricity system at kind of 40% of the mix. And then the emissions intensity, so the amount of CO2 released for every unit of electricity generated, we expect to halve in the coming decade. And another key finding at the headline level is that wind and solar is responsible for nearly all of the renewables growth to 2030. So what I've done here is I'm showing the EU27 renewable electricity production split down by the type of renewables. And what we see is that in 2018, wind and solar is around about half of the renewables, with bioenergy and hydro making up the rest. But as we move to 2030, you can see the wind in blue and the solar in yellow, predominantly pretty much all the growth. So this really is a wind and solar story over the coming decade. And on the wind and solar, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper now as a start on the country by country analysis. Just a kind of brief note that where we show country by country charts in the coming analysis, we only show the 19 countries responsible for nearly 97% of EU electricity consumption. But all the data is available on our website. And when we talk about EU numbers, so all the data by country is available on our website. When we talk about EU numbers as a whole, we do have all 27 countries included. So if we have a look and start the country by country analysis, and in that wind and solar, what we find is that EU wind and solar deployment over the next decade is extremely uneven. And what am I showing on the chart here? I'm showing the wind in blue, the solar in yellow, and I'm showing that the growth over the next decade as a share of the electricity mix. And the reason I do that is so that we can compare countries on a measure that is kind of avoids the fact that there are different sizes of each country. And what do we see is that the leaders, so right at the top of this chart, the Netherlands, Spain, Denmark, these countries are planning total transformations of their electricity system over the next decade. So transforming 50% or more of their electricity mix to wind and solar. At the other end of the spectrum, we see countries like Czechia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, generally in Eastern Europe, are planning very little wind and solar deployment at all. So while we have some healthy growth in wind and solar at an EU level, that growth is very uneven by country. And what does this growth mean for wind and solar in 2030 and the role in the electricity mix? We find that wind and solar remains a minor part of the electricity mix in 2030 across much of Eastern Europe. And what am I showing on the chart here? So the black dots, we are showing wind and solar's share of the electricity mix in 2018, the red dots showing 2030. And we can see on the left-hand side of the chart, again, the leaders with that growth in wind and solar that I showed in the previous slide, the Netherlands, Spain, Ireland, for example, all 70% or so or more of their electricity mix is going to be coming from wind and solar in 2030. And again, if you compare that to the other end, to the right-hand side of the chart, so the likes of Poland, Bulgaria, Czechia, for example, sort of well in 20% or well below. So really a very large range in the wind and solar role in the electricity mix. And you see the EU27 in the middle there, around about 40%, a little bit higher, 41% or so on the current NACPs. And that is important to kind of reinforce, is that this transformation is already well underway. The EU electricity mix will be 40% or more wind and solar by 2030. It's just still very spread out. And one final thing to say on this chart, if we add in what we achieved in the first half of 2020, so what I've done here is I've added a dot, the dark black, for the share that was achieved in the first half of 2020, we see that the wind and solar that the lagging countries, basically everyone from Romania on and then further to the right-hand side, what they're planning for 2030 is significantly lower than what the leading countries, we see Greece, Germany, Spain, Ireland, for example, sorry, not Spain, but Ireland, that are achieving already in the first half of 2020. It's showing that this kind of transition is possible. And what we've done is we've then compared the wind and solar deployment to what is needed to achieve climate targets. And we find that the wind and solar deployment needs to triple, the annual wind and solar deployment needs to triple versus last decade for a 55% emissions cut. And what I'm showing on the chart here is, in the gray is the average annual deployment of wind and solar in the last decade. The red, we're showing the commitments we already have in the national energy and climate plans. This is what governments are saying they're going to do. The yellow, we have what is needed for 55%, both from the EU Commission's own modelling and also a similar modelling exercise from CLIMAC, just to show that the EU Commission is probably a little bit low on the wind and solar side, but it's in the right ballpark for what you'd need for 55%. And then on the right in the green, I'm showing what you would need to achieve a scenario developed by CanEurope and EUB called the PAC scenario. And that achieves a 65% reduction in emissions by 2030 and climate neutrality, crucially, climate neutrality by 2040. And what this means is that while we still have, you can see the difference between the red and the yellow charts, we still have quite a way to go to get us on track for a 55% emissions cut. So a lot more wind and solar is needed. However, if we want to move into the PAC scenario territory, so climate neutrality by 2040, really the EU doing its fair share of what's required under the Paris Agreement, so climate neutrality before 2050, we need a total transformation of energy system planning in the next decade to deliver these numbers. Quick note on bioenergy. So compared to wind and solar, we view bioenergy, especially woody biomass, as higher risk as a source of renewable electricity, both on concerns of whether real climate benefits are actually delivered over Paris relevant timescales, but also the governance that we'd need to track to make sure that there was generally sustainable resource used, as well as concerns around biodiversity, food security, etc. So certainly one to keep an eye on. And while we said that at a total level, the growth in bioenergy is relatively muted compared to the huge growth in wind and solar, there are some larger changes at a national level which are hidden by those numbers. And so what I'm showing on the chart here is the expected growth in electricity generation from bioenergy from 2018 to 2030. And we see that Poland on the left, Spain, Sweden, and Finland really are the kind of key growth regions for bioenergy from electricity. I think it's fair to say there are reasonable concerns given the limited availability of genuinely sustainable biomass, whether this is a good use of bioenergy when there is a low cost wind and solar available. It would probably be better to keep this for higher value products such as chemicals, etc. And bringing this all together, so we've shown the data for wind and solar and also for bioenergy, and also including hydro. What does this mean for the renewable share in total by country according to the NACPs? So again, the same sort of chart as I showed for wind and solar, with 2018 renewable share in black and 2030 in the green. And again, what we see is that Eastern Europe is well below average on where the planned share of renewables in the electricity mix by 2030. And we can see that on the left-hand side, the leaders, so the kind of Austria, Spain, Portugal, for example, were in areas where they're already going to be providing 80% or more of their electricity from renewables by 2030. And on the flip side, Czechia, for example, Poland, Bulgaria, other laggards, much less than 30%, with the EU on course for around about 60%, give or take, as a whole. And one final thing to note on this is that compared to the wind and solar story, you can see the sort of high hydro and partly high bioenergy countries such as Sweden, Finland, Austria, doing significantly better on this metric. And a final point on the renewables growth. So we've already said it's very uneven. What happens if we compare that to last decade? And this is what we do on this chart. So in the green, we are showing the renewables growth in the coming decade. The black dot is the renewables growth in the previous decade. And what we find towards the right-hand side of the chart is that despite the well-publicized massive cost reduction in renewables in the last decade, countries such as Bulgaria, Romania, Czechia, they are planning lower deployment of renewables in the coming decade, this the key decade for climate action in the power sector, than in the previous decade, which just suggests to me that the energy ministries in these countries really are kind of struggling to keep up with the changing economics of wind and solar versus other power sources, as things are moving so fast in the energy system nowadays. And just to break up me speaking, we're going to have a little bit of a res poll that Hannah, I hope, is going to organise. Yes, so I've said where the NACPs are saying we're going to head on wind and solar, and we're saying if you could tell us what you think the EU will actually reach in 2030, given that costs are likely to continue to reduce and higher climate ambition is coming. It's interesting to get a sense of where you think the EU will be when we get to 2030. I'll give you a minute or so to finish that in, and I hope Hannah will let me know when that's done. Okay, so the results are in. I hope you can see them as well. So the majority, and a little bit higher than 41%. So vast majority, 75% or so of participants thinking that the EU will end up in somewhere in the 45 to 55 range. And for reference, the EU Commission thinks that we need about 45 or so, 46 to meet the 55% target, and obviously more for higher levels. Very interesting. Some very big numbers up there. 8% thinking 70% or more. Thank you for that. So let's press on with the next fuel. So nuclear, another source of zero carbon electricity. Debate obviously still raging as around the future role for nuclear in the electricity system. But what do the NACPs say for the next decade? And we find that the EU27 nuclear output is expected to fall by around about 20% to 2030, with Germany leading the declines. And that's from the kind of national phase out that Germany will have to do by law by 2022. Belgium also one of the big fallers in nuclear output, and that's a nuclear phase out slated for 2025. And on the right hand side of the chart, there are some nuclear growth areas, primarily Hungary and Finland in the next decade. But it's worth pointing out that with the exception of maybe half of the value of Finland and the Slovakian numbers, the remaining growth in nuclear is all slated for right at the end of next decade. So certainly quite a bit of risk that that doesn't materialize given recent history of nuclear build-outs. And one important thing to note on this chart as well is that we've heard about big plans in Bulgaria, Czechia, Poland for new nuclear reactors, but all of those plans are slated for kind of mid-2030s or so. So absolutely no contribution from those reactors to the decarbonization of the electricity system in this critical decade to 2030. Moving on to fossil fuels. So obviously an area most people are very, very interested in. And if we dive straight into coal, and huge interest in coal, of course, because to put us on a Paris compatible power sector trajectory, we need to phase out coal in the EU by 2030. And what we're seeing in the NACPs is that perhaps only half or so of the coal generation that we saw in 2018 will be gone by 2030, with 90% of the remaining coal generation expected to be in Germany, Poland, and Czechia. Poland in the black, Germany in the red, and Czechia in the kind of light blue color. And here we're showing total generation from coal in 2018, 2025, and 2030. It's worth mentioning that the figures projected by the member states for coal generation in 2030 are higher than what the EU Commission expects, even with no further climate action, which suggests that these figures are slightly, member states are slightly overestimating their coal generation versus what will happen in reality. And looking at the NACPs, we find that perhaps one of the reasons is a poor accounting for interconnectors and the exchange of electricity. So moving on swiftly to gas, fossil gas. Again, I'm showing the electricity generation from fossil gas by country and by year. And we see that there's no major change expected according to the NACPs in fossil gas burn in the power sector to 2030, broadly flatlined, but worth mentioning that it's 2030 is lower than 2019 because there was quite a big pickup in gas in 2019. But there are larger changes at the national level, and we see in Italy and Germany, the black and the red on the chart, very large growth between 2018 and 25, and that's primarily driven by a switch from coal to gas in the power sector, but also in Germany also because of the nuclear phase out. And to 2030, we then expect to see that Italian number come down, but that's reliant on the successful delivery of the Italian renewables plans. Obviously, the risk that if any of those delayed, that fossil gas will be locked in for a bit longer. And then Belgium really is a special case to mention. Belgium, the largest growth region for fossil gas burn in the blue between 2018 and 2030, driven by the nuclear phase out and insufficient renewables and efficiency measures to offset that large loss in power output. If we combine everything we've spoken about in the previous slide, so the renewables, the nuclear, and the fossil fuels, and we look at a really key metric, so what is the share of fossil fuels in the electricity mix in 2030, and how does that compare to 2018? And what we find is that the EU still has quite a fair amount of fossil fuels in the electricity mix in 2030, with some countries much, much higher. And that's what I'm showing on the chart here. In the red, I'm showing the share of electricity production from fossil fuels in 2030. And for reference, we're showing the black dot 2018. And the most important thing to know is we really care about the countries on the left-hand side of this chart. So these are the countries with very high shares of fossil fuels, where significant action is going to be needed to be taken to remove these over the next decade, especially with higher climate targets. And for example, Poland, Belgium, Czechia, Bulgaria, Italy, and Germany, kind of all sort of 40% and above still fossil fuels in electricity mix. And looking at the black dots as well, there's some countries where really very little progress is being made in the next decade. Bulgaria notably, Czechia as well, and Belgium again. Belgium, the only country where the share of fossil fuels is actually increasing in the electricity mix over the next decade, as there's a switch from nuclear to gas. And on average, the EU around about 25% or so of fossil fuels in the mix by 2030. Of course, it's not just the fossil fuels, but also what type of fossil fuel is important. And just focusing on the 2030 figure, one of the major problems we're seeing is that the countries with the higher shares of fossil fuels also have the higher shares of coal as well. So the majority of the fossil fuel share in Poland, Czechia, and Bulgaria is all coal. And there are still fairly notably large shares of coal in Germany and Romania as well. Whereas the high fossil fuel shares in Belgium and Italy, in the yellow, is all gas. So a little brief break as well for the next poll. And what we'd like to ask you is, Europe needs to phase out coal in power by 2030 to meet commitments in the Paris Agreement. But what year will the European coal phase out actually happen? So I'll give you a minute or so, 30 seconds or so to jump into that. Perhaps we were too unoptimistic by only including 2027 as our first date. Okay, so results are in. 2035 clearly the favorite, but yeah, a lot of spread around that area, looking in the sort of 2033 to 2038 range. So certainly people thinking that last chunk of coal, perhaps in Poland, Czechia, maybe even Bulgaria, might be a little bit tougher to remove for that 2030 date. Thanks very much for those responses. Moving on to the next section. So we have a brief bit here on electricity demand, and this is a really key metric to track in the coming decade. So the electricity system going to be a really important driver of decarbonisation in the rest of the sectors by electrification of transport, production of green hydrogen for industry, for example, and maybe even electrification of heat later on as well. And what we see here, and what I'm showing, is that the EU 27 electricity demand is expected to grow by around 5% to 2030. And this chart shows the growth on the y-axis in electricity demand in percentage terms between now and 2030, and then the country in the two-letter code, and the bubble size shows you the size of the electricity system in 2018. So you can generally see that the larger electricity systems, the Germany's, France, Italy, showing much slower growth. And what we can do is we can broadly put the growth regions into two buckets. So we have the countries such as Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, where electricity demand is currently significantly below average per person. and the growth rates we're seeing there are reasonably consistent, if not lower than we would expect to see if those countries were planning to catch up to the Western European demand rate. But we also have a group of countries where demand growth is significantly more than you would expect from their demand per capita, and these are countries like Portugal, Ireland, Denmark, and to a lesser extent also Austria and Belgium. And these are countries where the analysis shows that there's a structural change in the way that electricity is being consumed. And worth bearing in mind that for Germany, for example, there are concerns that the figures that are in the NACPs are quite unrealistic given the amount of electrification that's expected to take place. So this is a really key metric to keep a hold on in the coming decades or coming years, as anywhere we can reduce the demand use through efficiency measures, we can reduce the role and the longevity of fossil fuels, and reduce the need for additional renewables growth to meet that demand. And finally, moving on to CO2 emissions. So we have done some calculations based on the electricity mixes from the NACPs. Just a quick note on the calculations: we use standard CO2 emissions factors. So we exclude any upstream greenhouse gas emissions released during the extraction and transportation of fossil fuels, for example, methane leakage. So those aren't included, so that's something to be aware of. And we have one emissions factor for all countries, so you lose the nuance of power plant efficiency, CHPs, etc. But for 2030, this is a reasonably good first order approximation. And what we find is that putting those numbers together, Germany, Poland, Italy, and Czechia will account for 70% of EU power sector emissions by 2030 on the current plans laid out in the NACP. And here on the tree diagram, that's what we're showing. We're showing the share of the whole power sector emissions that has been taken up by country. And that share of the pie from Germany, Poland, Italy, and Czechia it's already a high share in 2018, sort of 60% or so, but growing even further to account for almost 3/4 of the power sector emissions. So no surprises there on kind of Poland on the level of coal in the mix, but also Germany, large amounts of coal, large amounts of fossil fuels, and a very large demand base, so almost a third of emissions. And if we look at this on a emissions intensity measure, so what is the emissions per unit of electricity generated, we see that very, very large spread by countries by 2030, but some very serious laggards on Poland, Czechia, and Bulgaria, significantly higher, more emissions intensive electricity than anywhere else in Europe. But Germany, Belgium, Romania, Italy still well above average in 2030. And primarily, of course, related to the amount of coal in the mix, but also for Italy and Belgium based on the high level of fossil gas in the mix. So to draw this to some conclusions, and as I said, we were trying to make the case for these 7 countries being the primary areas we need to see greater ambition in the power sector to 2030. So we find that 7 countries are blocking the EU electricity transition. Together, they're responsible for 80% of the EU power sector emissions in 2030. And we split these into 2 broad categories. So we have the 5 countries that we class as limited or no progress. So Belgium, Bulgaria, Czechia, Romania, and Poland. Together, they're responsible for 40% of emissions. We see very little progress in the power sector over the entirety of the coming decade. Very low renewables growth. In Belgium, for example, we said the emissions are actually getting dirtier in the time, high shares of coal, high demand growth. And yeah, together 40% of emissions. And then a second bucket, also worth 40% of emissions, we term as slow progress, Germany and Italy. So a little bit more progress is being made, but it's very slow relative to the total size of the economies. And that's a major concern given the kind of absolute level of emissions that we produce from these power sectors. And what we've done is we've produced fact sheets for the 7 countries and in both the English and local languages. And you can find those on our website. And we have a little bit of extra available data in those fact sheets that I won't go into detail in this presentation. But for example, we compare in each country, we compare the electricity mix of that country to the EU average. So here the example being comparing Poland's electricity mix in 2030 to the EU 27 in 2030. And the bottom two charts, you see coal very, very much higher as a percentage share in the mix, lower nuclear than average and lower renewables than average. And again, those fact sheets are available on the website. And some final kind of headline conclusions. So the NACPs demonstrate that we are going to undergo a major transformation in the EU power sector. Wind and solar will become the backbone of the EU electricity system, but Eastern Europe is falling very far behind and falling further behind than where they are now. The planned deployment of wind and solar is insufficient to meet the higher climate ambitions, the 55%, and let alone the 60% targeted by the EU Parliament. And urgent progress, as we said, is especially needed in 7 countries that are blocking the EU's electricity transition. And a final note on open source data. So all of the data for all of the graphs in this presentation and for the report and everything we have on the NACPs and the electricity system is all available on our website. So please do go ahead, use that, share that, and very welcome for feedback on that as well. So thanks very much for listening. And I think we are hopefully going to have a few national perspectives from attendees on the call.
Thank you so much, Charles, for your presentation. Yes, we're delighted now to hand over to a few representatives from across Poland, Romania and Bulgaria to share a few reflections from a national context, and then we'll open the floor out to questions. It's great to see that there's already a couple coming in the Q&A function, so please do take this opportunity to add any questions that you'd like raised. So first of all, I'd love to hand over to Michał Hedmanski from Instra in Poland, who will introduce himself and share a few reflections on the Polish context. And I know my colleague Phil is going to set him up as a panelist so that he can share his video and switch on the microphone as well.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks, Charles. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. I'll try to be brief. So thank you very much for the fantastic presentation and an overview. I believe the last slide you pointed out on the data, open access to the data is quite crucial, not only for us, but for the folks in the European Commission that did the same job and also assessed the NACPs with regard to the ambition that is depicted in numbers. And we also push on our side internally in Poland on how to increase the level of detail and openness, because this is also a measure where you can track how much does the government is proudly introducing to the stakeholders the strategy of phasing out coal and raising climate ambitions. So hence I much sympathize also with the methodology that you apply. There is a good saying in Poland, turn the table around and the Poland is back on the top. And I see you can apply it also here. And Poland is in fact the country with the highest share of coal in the mix currently. But as it stems from your results, it will be also compared to the other also CEE countries in 2030. But when I ask myself a question, what's the reason? What's the rationale behind this? I think we should get back to the time machine and consider the circumstances and the dynamics we saw some 2 years ago when the NACPs were drafted and established. And I assume that when the Commission sends the NACPs back to for some reassessment, the numbers need to be updated with regard to the current ambitious goal of 55% emission reduction in 2030. So I think the results that you're showing, that Poland will have the highest emissivity and highest share of fossil fuels, but also coal, might be slightly, might look slightly might be different from what you're depicting today. And I hope that NACP of Poland will be much more favoring not only other fossil fuel gas, but also renewables, which bring the highest potential to achieve the 2030 target. Thank you.
Thank you, Michał. And yeah, we very much hope to see the ambition raised in these NACPs, and that we can analyse again in a year's time and see how things have changed. So now I'll hand over to Laura Nazari from Bankwatch, who's joining us from Romania. Hi, Laura.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm Laura Nazari. I work for Bankwatch Romania. I'm an energy transformation and European funding campaigner. Our association supports an ambitious transformation of the energy sector by gradually eliminating fossil fuels and replacing them with renewable energy and energy efficiency measures. When it comes up to the energy transition for Romania, this is an inevitable process we need to implement. But until now, unfortunately, no clear actions and legislation has been approved for the decarbonization of the energy sector. We are one of the 7 European countries that don't have yet a coal phase-out plan, even though an important part of the national energy mix is represented by coal. As your analysis has shown, the Romanian NACP includes almost 2 gigawatts of installed coal capacity until 2030, and even plans to increase the gas capacities as well, gas being seen as a transitional fuel and suitable for the country's energy transition. Evidently, this is a wrong move, not only because it contradicts the need for decarbonization, which has been stated repeatedly by Romanian statesmen, but because this will lead to the point where we'll need to prepare for a second energy transition. We have a huge potential for renewable energy sources. I'm speaking here about solar and wind in particular, which isn't explored to its fullest. The renewable energy in Romania needs a suitable, stable and predictable regulatory framework and clear actions that will help increase the renewable intake at national level. We also need to accelerate the deployment of energy efficiency measures, and combined with increasing the renewable energy share, this will contribute incredibly to the success of Romania's energy transition. Unfortunately, the NACP is a non-ambitious document which will steer our strategy for our energy sector, but I'm happy to see your results and your report, and I think it will be very useful to mobilize officials and to advocate for just and clean energy transition here in Romania. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and it's great to hear that it will be of help in your national campaigning as well. I'd now like to hand over to Balin Balanov, who's joining us from Greenpeace in Bulgaria.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and great job, Ember team. To be honest, my heart hurted every time the name of Bulgaria was mentioned, just because it was always in a bad way, as a bad example. Bulgarian energy and climate plan stands in line with the verbal messages coming from the current parliament, government, and the prime minister, who is in power for around 10 years already. There is no popular Bulgarian politician who supports publicly renewable energy, not at all, not even one. For the last year, in the media, there are only messages and plans about supporting the coal sector in the country, fossil fuel power plants, and one imaginable new nuclear power station. In Bulgaria, the conversation about the transformation of the energy system and transition to a decentralized and based on renewables model has not yet begun. Citizens are still in the role of passive participants who only pay bills. If they don't look for it proactively, no institution will give them information about what their role in the energy transition could be and what the benefits might be for them. In theory, even now, almost every Bulgarian can connect to the grid as a producer of electricity. It's also famous prosumer, so-called, but in practice it's quite a difficult procedure to become a prosumer in Bulgaria, a procedure that takes valuable time and money. Pretty straightforward sounds the European Commission also when it comes to the Bulgarian Energy and Climate Plan, because we have already we got the assessment of the European Commission, and especially the topic of prosumers that I mentioned. According to the Commission, the final plan does not include no details on the form of support it intends to provide. It only refers in general terms to unspecified changes in the legislation that should be made to optimize the current framework and to regulate the rights of self-consumer in a more satisfactory way. I'm sure that this is not the biggest problem of the Bulgarian government right now, but it is also a sign that our country is highly dependent on fossil fuels and the countries where they come from. Bulgarian authorities do not support on any level the rise of renewable energy production, and the participation of the citizens in the energy system as prosumers is something that can't even imagine to promote. I'm talking about our politician. It is sad to say, but I have to admit that in Bulgaria, there is no existing energy cooperative, not even one. But the local Greenpeace team, as well as other NGOs and a number of adventurers, work hardly for this to happen soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Valin. It's really helpful to understand some of the challenges and barriers in Bulgaria as we move forward into the next decade. So now we'll move on to the questions section, and thank you again to Balin, Laura and Mikhail for sharing some context from their countries. So I'm going to start with the questions that have the most upvotes. So to start us off, we have a question from Thomas Gibbon. What measures could concretely lead to a premature phase out of coal in the EU? In other words, what will force Germany, etc., to abandon a resource that is cheap and abundant domestically? A carbon tax, EU legislation? Here you go, Charles.
Yeah, that's a great question. I suppose I'd immediately raise the fact that the hard coal, especially, maybe not so much lignite, but hard coal especially, is not a cheap and abundant resource anymore. Pretty much everywhere in the EU, it either is or very will be in the very near future cheaper to build new renewables than operate existing hard coal units. Lignite is more challenging, it's cheaper, but we would expect to see carbon pricing ramping up quite considerably over the next decade. So that will also become certainly more under threat. In terms of what we need, I hope that I've highlighted in this presentation that there is a considerable missing gap to be filled on what we see as now very cheap wind and solar across a number of countries, especially in Eastern Europe, but Germany will need to go further as well. There's no nuclear in that mix, and so you end up with a lot of a high fossil fuel percentage, even given the Energiewende and the build out of renewables in the last decade. And I suppose to quote Antonella from the Renewables Grid Initiative, I was on a great webinar yesterday, we need more Europe. So we need more interconnectors, we need more flexibility to be able to incorporate these renewables into the mix. So I suppose that as far as I'm going, I suppose to summarize is that hard coal is no longer cheap. Lignite won't be once the carbon prices start rising further. So the question now is, how do we get more renewables into the mix, and how do we ensure the flexibility is available to integrate those successfully?
Thanks, Charles. The next question is specifically on Belgium. A question from Dirk asking, what would happen if Belgium kept the nuclear on instead of gas plants?
So we had a question from this from a from a Belgian journalist as well. So we looked at a scenario where they kept on 2 gigawatts of nuclear in 2030, and that was seen as the level, I think, at least from the news story, that was seen the level that could feasibly stay on their old plants, and that would bring Belgium's emissions intensity down to around about the EU average. So certainly some progress, but it's not just a case of this can't be fixed with just keeping some nuclear on. We need more renewables deployment in that country as well. And there's a challenge on the governance structures. So the federal government in charge of the offshore, which is doing reasonably okay. The more challenging is on the wind and solar onshore, which needs to be stepped up.
Thanks. And the next question is from Georgie Dalos, saying that some of the countries promise massive changes, for example, renewables in Netherlands. How can we believe them, and have they been able to deliver on earlier plans?
That's a great question, and the Netherlands is certainly an example of having the lowest targets and failing to deliver those in recent years. I think it is a difficult one to. It's a two-stage process. We need to track the ambition, which is what we're doing here. This is what governments are saying they're going to do, and we need to hold them to that. But there's a much more kind of nitty-gritty, on the ground job of kind of making sure that the barriers to renewables that we're talking about need to be removed, I certainly think that is a tough one. That and it was out of scope of this report. I would refer you to, where possible, kind of Solar Power Europe, Wind Power Europe, do some excellent analysis on much more on the credibility of these plans beyond just the ambition in there. But I would certainly say that the Netherlands, in particular, has the biggest challenge over the next decade, because they're starting from the lowest base and supposedly going up to 75% wind and solar. So yeah, huge challenge, and let's hope they deliver.
Thanks, Charles. Now we have a couple of questions relating to intermittency issues with wind and solar specifically. So Dirk is asking, do the transition to wind and solar have limitations due to weather constraints? And then I'll also ask Laura if she'd like to comment on a question that's in the chat, with Romanian politicians saying that we can't do the transition without gas because of intermittency problems with renewables, and how can we address that concern within Romania? So Charles, I'll hand over to you first.
So on the kind of how far can we go on the renewables side, I think it's fair to say that the last, let's say 10-20% of the electricity mix, we're not quite there yet in terms of understanding can we get there. We have models to show these 100% renewable worlds, and so theoretically it's possible, and it's just a question of proving that it is possible as we move along. And I think everyone now is very, very confident that we can get up to these high levels, 70-80%, with a combination of flexibility, backup generation, storage. We've got basically the answer to the question is access as much flexibility as you possibly can from every possible source, whether that's interconnectors or from the batteries in people's cars, etc. But that final 20% is perhaps the area where there's still some debate, and I wouldn't be super comfortable in saying yes, we can 100% do that, because a lot of it is modeling. But hopefully what we can see in these results is that as we move through the coming decade, we will start seeing countries approaching very, very high levels of renewables integration. And it's important that we also sell that story globally, as well as the EU, to show that these major economies can achieve these high shares of renewables in the mix going forward. Sorry, Hannah, was another question on, was for Laura to respond?
Yeah, Laura, I don't know if you want to add any reflections on the Romanian context at all.
I think I will answer the question from the participants, if I may, about the is it possible for Romania to have more renewables and no new investments in gas? I think it is possible, because investing in gas isn't feasible economically. I think it will pose great financial risks to do that, and with the money available, we can spend it in modernizing our energy transport system and digitalize it and implement various measures that will help integrate better the renewables into the grid. Unless we do that, I don't think it will be possible for Romania to explore its huge renewable potential, but it isn't a solution to invest huge amount of money in natural gas just to transition after that once again. So yeah, this is my opinion on this.
Great, thank you, Laura.
I think just to react to that, sorry, Hannah,
yeah,
as well, is that one thing I'm wary of is that the debate gets too focused often on how do we get to 100% renewables, whereas what we show from the analysis is that so many of the countries across Europe, especially across Eastern Europe, are at very, very low levels, 10-15% or so of wind and solar in the mix. And it's demonstrably possible already. The leading countries are showing that, and in the first half of this year, that you can do easily, not easily, sorry, but we can integrate 45-50%. It's happening in major economies. So I think there are valuable, and there are kind of real challenges as we move forward and to get all that flexibility, but I'm always wary of the debate being too focused on the sort of very end goal rather than sort of immediate emissions reductions that we can achieve by upping renewables deployment.
Thanks, Charles. And as we've reached the hour, I'll give you one final question that has 2 upvotes. But for those who've raised questions that we won't get to, we'll take a note of these and we'll send an email to you all with the presentation and maybe address some of these questions as well. So the final question, Charles, is any idea about the huge expected increase in electricity consumption in some countries such as Denmark? 35% seems a lot.
We haven't looked into those figures specifically, and part of the problem is that these electricity consumers that have the highest percentage increases are also quite small countries. So I think there are some regions where data centers, for example, are being very quickly and rapidly installed to make use of renewable electricity given corporate requirements. That's possible. But also these are the countries that are furthest ahead in the electricity transition. So for example, in Portugal, very big green hydrogen plans in the next decade. So I agree, the numbers look big, but it's worth bearing in mind that that is a percentage increase from a small base, and they're the kind of countries where we're putting huge data centers or a gigawatt or 2 of green hydrogen production would make a material impact on total electricity demand.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to Laura, Michal, and Balin for joining us as well, and to all of you who've logged into the webinar. We hope it's been interesting and informative, and we look forward to staying in touch with you and carrying on these conversations after this. So thank you all.